Right now, 761 million people are streaming through Spotify, 293 million of them paying every month. The company ended music piracy. It has paid out nearly $70 billion to the music industry since it launched, and it still took 18 years, until 2024, to report its very first full year of profit. That is not bad luck. That is the design. Spotify built a business where growth and debt rise together. The more people who join, the more money is owed by contract, before Spotify itself ever keeps a cent of it. Roughly 2 out of every $3 it earns are already spoken for by a deal signed back in 2008, years before most of those 761 million users had ever heard of the company. This is the company that rescued the music industry from collapse and handed that same industry a permanent claim on Spotify's own bank account. Every time a song plays, the money moves through Spotify. Most of it does not stay. To understand how that trap got built, go back to Stockholm in 2006. Daniel Ek was in his early 20s, already on his second company, an online advertising business he had just sold to a firm called Trade Doubler. Trade Doubler's co-founder was a Swedish entrepreneur named Martin Lorentzon. The sale is how the two men met. Ek pitched an idea he had been chewing on since Napster's collapse in the early 2000s, a legal way to stream music that was actually better than stealing it. Because by 2006, piracy had already won. Napster was dead, but Kazaa, LimeWire, and the Pirate Bay, a site founded in Sweden itself, had taken its place. Ek put it simply, you can never legislate away from piracy. The only way to solve the problem was to build a service that was better than piracy, and at the same time, compensated the music industry. The idea itself was older than the company. Ek had been sketching plans for an instant, legal streaming platform since 2002, in the immediate aftermath of Napster's shutdown. Ek and Lorentzon founded the company that April, funding it with their own savings after outside investors passed. The name, as the story goes, came from Ek mishearing something Lorentzon said. They later rationalized it as a portmanteau of spot and identify. They spent the next 2 years quietly negotiating with record labels, trying to build a catalog large enough to matter. On October 7, 2008, Spotify launched Invite Only in Sweden and a handful of European countries. Free, ad-supported, no downloads. The UK followed in February 2009. Opening public registration before demand forced it back to invite only within weeks, a small, humble, faintly idealistic bet that people would rather listen legally than steal. But a good idea was not enough to launch. Spotify needed music, every major label's catalog all at once, or it had nothing to stream at all. Miss even one major label and the pitch collapses. A legal alternative to piracy that is missing entire artists' back catalogs is not actually better than piracy. It is worse, and the labels knew it. Without Sony, Universal, Warner, EMI, and the independent labels behind Merlin, Spotify was an empty app with a nice interface. This was the same industry that had already sued Napster into bankruptcy and watched physical sales evaporate through the 2000s. And now, a 20-something Swede was asking them to hand over their entire catalogs, free to listen this time, to an unproven streaming company with no track record, no leverage, and, at the time, barely any users at all. Some of the independent labels were openly skeptical that an ad-supported free tier could ever generate enough money to justify handing over a single song, let alone an entire catalog. Throughout 2007, Ek and Lorentzon negotiated, not as equals, as supplicants. Spotify was not simply building a product. It was asking permission to exist, from the very industry it claimed it was going to save. If the label said no, there was no Spotify. That dependency would never really go away. It would just get written into a contract, one clause at a time, until it looked permanent, because it was. In 2008, the labels finally said yes, and the fine print of that yes still shapes Spotify today. Sony took 6% of Spotify's equity. Universal took 5%. Warner took 4%. EMI took 2%. Merlin, representing the independents, took 1%. Combined, the major rights holders walked away owning roughly 18% of the company, nearly 1 in 5 shares, for a total price across all of them, reportedly just under 9,000 euros. Almost nothing for a stake that would later be worth hundreds of millions. That equity also made the labels something new. Not just suppliers, but shareholders, with a direct stake in whatever Spotify eventually became, on top of the royalties they were already guaranteed on every stream. When the payoff came years later, some of it really did reach artists, as an account credit. Most of it, and most of the underlying shares, simply stayed with the labels. But the equity was the smaller part of the deal. The larger part was the royalty structure it came bundled with, a formula that would send roughly 2/3 of all of Spotify's future revenue back to rights holders, permanently, on every single stream, forever. Not for a year, not until Spotify found its footing, forever. At the time, it looked like the only reasonable trade available. The labels needed cash and some protection against a business they did not control. Spotify needed a catalog, or it had no company at all. Neither side was being unreasonable, but that formula did something no one fully reckoned with in 2008. It fixed Spotify's ceiling before Spotify had a single paying customer. Whatever the company built, however many hundreds of millions of people eventually signed up, roughly 70 cents of every dollar was already spoken for. 17 years later, that split has barely moved. And the deal worked. It let Spotify grow fast. Spotify launched in the United States in July 2011. By 2018, it was ready to go public, not through a normal IPO, but a direct listing on the New York Stock Exchange, skipping the usual bank-led roadshow entirely. Spotify did not need to raise new capital. It simply let existing shareholders, employees, early investors, and yes, those same labels, sell directly into the market on day one. On April 3rd, shares opened at $165.90, implying a market value of roughly $29.5 billion, about 4 times Spotify's own guided revenue for that year. They closed the day at $149.01, still worth around $26 to $27 billion. The labels cashed in immediately. Sony sold roughly half its stake that year for about $750 million. Warner sold its entire stake for around $500 million. Universal's position, briefly boosted after it acquired EMI, had been diluted down to about 3.5% by listing day, still worth a fortune, for shares that had cost the labels almost nothing a decade earlier. It was, by any measure, a genuine triumph. One of the biggest streaming companies on Earth, built from a Swedish startup with no leverage. But look at the other side of the ledger. Even at that scale, Spotify's gross margin stayed stuck near 30%. Not because the company was mismanaged, because the 2008 contract had already decided, years in advance, exactly how much of this growth Spotify would actually get to keep. And in January 2022, the true shape of that arrangement became visible, not in a spreadsheet, but in one weekend. Earlier that month, an open letter signed by more than 270 scientists and doctors had accused the Joe Rogan Experience of spreading COVID misinformation, singling out one episode featuring a physician promoting conspiracy theories. Then, on January 24th, Neil Young posted his own ultimatum on his website. It did not stay online for long before it came down. But by then, everyone had already read it. They can have Rogan or Young, not both. Young called Spotify the home of life-threatening COVID misinformation. Spotify had a podcast deal with Rogan reportedly worth well over $100 million. Young's entire back catalog, 5 decades of music, was worth far less to Spotify's bottom line, whatever it meant to the culture. Within about 48 hours, on January 26th and 27th, Spotify made its choice. Young's music came down, Rogan stayed up. Covers of his songs, recorded by other artists, stayed on the platform the entire time. Only Young's own recordings vanished. Spotify's public statement was almost gentle. We regret Neil's decision to remove his music from Spotify, but hope to welcome him back soon. Young later said Spotify represented roughly 60% of his global streaming income, and he pulled his catalog anyway. Within days, Joni Mitchell followed, then India Arie. Spotify did remove more than 20,000 COVID-related podcast episodes under its policies around the same time, a partial concession that changed nothing about who it had chosen to keep. This was the moment the platform's real customer became visible on screen, not the artist, not even really the listener, whoever was paid enough to stay. Neil Young would return to Spotify 2 years later, in March 2024, quietly ending a protest that, in the end, had never actually cost the company anything it wasn't already willing to pay. 2 years after choosing Rogan, the company that could not afford to lose him finally turned a profit. In 2023, Spotify posted a net loss of 532 million euros. In 2024, that flipped completely. A net income of 1.138 billion euros. Spotify's first full year in the black, 18 years after it was founded. But look at what else happened in 2024. That same April, Spotify introduced a new rule. Any track earning fewer than 1,000 streams in a year would receive no royalty at all. The company called it a fix for fraud and noise in the system. In practice, it meant the smallest, least streamed artists, the ones furthest from a career, closest to just starting out, got cut out of the royalty pool entirely, so the money could be redistributed toward tracks that already streamed more. Profitability, in part, funded by narrowing who gets paid at the bottom. That is the acidic math underneath the platform's own numbers. Spotify insists there is no single fixed per-stream rate. It pools subscription and ad revenue by country, keeps around 30%, and pays out the rest based on each rights holder's share of total streams in that market. It is a defensible model. It is also, by every independent estimate, worth somewhere between 0.3 and half a cent per stream. At that rate, 1 million plays is worth roughly $3,000 to $5,000 to a rights holder, before a label or distributor takes its own cut. Meanwhile, on the other side of the business, Apple and Google were still taking between 15 and 30% of app revenue. The dispute over exactly that was serious enough that the EU fined Apple 1.8 billion euros in the same case Spotify itself had filed. Squeezed from above by platform fees and locked in from below by 2008's royalty math, Spotify paid out more than $11 billion in 2025 alone, nearly $70 billion cumulatively since launch. Its stock had climbed about 40% that year alone. 761 million users, 293 million of them paying, and Spotify still keeps only about 30 cents of every dollar that passes through it. So, Spotify is trying to escape the trap it signed itself into by leaving music behind, one format at a time. Audiobooks, launched in 2023, had grown to more than 500,000 titles across 14 markets by late 2025. An AI DJ now picks songs and talks between them. Video podcasts now compete for the same attention. None of these formats carry the same fixed, decades-old royalty math that music does. That is not an accident. It is the whole point. It would be easy to call this corporate greed and move on. That is too easy. Every party made a reasonable decision in order across 18 years. Labels needed cash and protection in 2008. Spotify needed a catalog, or it had no company. And neither one has managed to fully undo what that first deal built. The uncomfortable pattern is not that one company got greedy. It is that this is what the math looks like when the people who make the product own less of the platform's future than the people who merely licensed it. Tonight, 761 million people will open the app again. The music will play. The company that ended piracy is still standing, and most of the money still will not stay. Nearly $70 billion paid to the music industry since 2008. First full year of profit 2024, 18 years after founding. 2/3 of every dollar still isn't Spotify's to keep.